A whisper echoes through the ancient church halls as a killer strikes amid harmonious voices, silencing one forever. Welcome to Miss Marple and the Truth Hidden in the Parish Choir, a tale of deception in a quiet village. Grab a cup of tea, take a seat, and enjoy the story. If you enjoy it, subscribe to our channel. Your support means a lot to us. And where are you watching from? Tell us in the comments. Chapter 1. The village awakens in the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead. Nestled among rolling green hills and quaint cottages, life moved at a gentle pace where everyone knew each other's secrets, or so they thought. Our story begins on a crisp autumn morning, when the sun peeked over the horizon, casting golden rays on the dew-kissed leaves. Miss Jane Marple, an elderly spinster with a sharp mind and a knack for unravelling mysteries, sat in her cosy parlour, knitting an intricate scarf, while gazing out the window at the bustling village square. She had lived here all her life, observing the comings and goings of her neighbours with keen interest. Today something felt off, a subtle shift in the air like the calm before a storm. As Miss Marple sipped her morning tea, she heard the distant toll of the church bell calling the faithful to the parish choir practice. The choir was the heart of the community, led by the stern yet passionate Reverend Thomas Hale, a man in his 50s with a booming voice and a reputation for perfectionism. The members ranged from young sopranos to elderly basses, each bringing their unique flair to the hymns that filled the air every Sunday. But lately, whispers of discord had reached Miss Marple's ears, arguments over solo parts, jealousies simmering beneath the surface, and a mysterious newcomer who had joined just weeks ago. Enter Eliza Thorne, a striking woman in her 30s with raven hair and piercing blue eyes, who had moved to the village from the bustling city of London. She claimed to seek a quieter life, but her sophisticated demeanour and expensive attire raised eyebrows among the locals. Eliza quickly became a standout in the choir, her soprano voice soaring above the rest, earning her the lead in the upcoming Christmas concert. This didn't sit well with longtime member Margaret Wilkins, a plump, cheerful widow who had held that position for years. Margaret confided in Miss Marple during a garden tea party that she felt pushed aside her years of dedication overlooked for this flashy outsider. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, her mind already piecing together the puzzle. She recalled similar situations in her youth where envy led to unexpected troubles. For instance, there was the case of the garden club rivalry, where a poisoned rose bush revealed deeper grudges. Here too she sensed underlying tensions, perhaps more sinister than mere jealousy. As the day progressed, Miss Marple decided to attend the choir practice herself, under the pretense of delivering fresh-baked scones to the Reverend. The church, a Gothic structure with stained glass windows depicting biblical scenes, loomed ahead, its stone walls echoing with history. Inside, the choir loft was alive with activity. Reverend Hale stood at the podium waving his baton energetically. Sing from the diaphragm, he bellowed as the group launched into a rendition of Ave Maria. Eliza stood front and centre, her voice clear and powerful, drawing admiring glances from some and envious glares from others. Margaret, positioned in the back row, fumbled her notes, her face flushed with frustration. Beside her was young Timothy Grant, a lanky teenager with a tenor voice, who idolized Eliza, often staying late to practice duets with her. Then there was old Mr. Harold Finch, the bass singer, a retired banker with a gruff exterior but a kind heart, who grumbled about the new arrangements disrupting tradition. As the practice ended, a heated exchange erupted between Eliza and Margaret. "You think you're so superior with your city ways," Margaret hissed, her hands clenched. Eliza smiled coolly, replying, "Experience counts for something, dear. Perhaps you should practice more." The Reverend intervened, ushering everyone out, but Miss Marple lingered, pretending to adjust her hat while eavesdropping. She noted the way Timothy watched Eliza with puppy-like adoration, and how Mr. Finch shook his head in disapproval. Little did they know that this minor spat was the spark for something far darker. That evening, as Miss Marple walked home, she pondered the dynamics. Villages like St. Mary Mead were microcosms of human nature where small slights could escalate into major conflicts. She remembered a tip from her nephew Raymond, a detective in Scotland Yard: always look for the motive hidden in plain sight. In this case, motives abounded: jealousy, ambition, perhaps even love. For practical advice, if you're ever in a group like a choir, observe body language. Crossed arms indicate defensiveness, while averted eyes suggest deceit. Miss Marple used such observations to her advantage. Back in her cottage, she settled by the fire, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. The village seemed peaceful under the starry sky, but she knew appearances deceived. Tomorrow would bring choir members to her door, seeking advice or sharing gossip, and she would listen carefully, sifting truth from fabrication. As the clock struck 9, she whispered to herself, "The truth is like a melody. It emerges note by note." This sets the stage for our mystery, introducing the key players and hinting at brewing conflicts. Stay tuned for what unfolds next when a shocking discovery shakes the village to its core. Chapter 2. The silent note dawn broke grey and heavy the next morning, with mist curling around the church spire like a shroud. Miss Marple rose early, her routine unbroken by the previous day's murmurs. She slipped on her tweed coat and walked the cobbled path to the village shop for fresh milk. Mrs. Gladys, the shopkeeper, greeted her with wide eyes and lowered voice. "Terrible business, Miss Marple," she muttered, handing over the bottle. "Eliza Thorne didn't come home last night." Her landlady, Mrs. Phipps, knocked at dawn, no answer door locked from inside. Miss Marple kept her expression neutral, though her pulse quickened. Locked from inside echoed in her mind a phrase straight from locked room puzzles she had read in her nephew's case files. She thanked Gladys and continued to the church, where the choir planned a special rehearsal for the Christmas piece. The heavy oak door creaked open, revealing Reverend Hale pacing the aisle, his face ashen. He spotted Miss Marple and hurried over. "Jane, thank heavens you're here. Eliza's missing and we can't reach her. The solo part hangs in the balance." The choir assembled in scattered clusters, their usual chatter replaced by uneasy whispers. Margaret Wilkins sat rigidly in the front pew, clutching her hymn book like a shield. Timothy Grant hovered near the organ, his fingers drumming nervously on the wood. Mr. Finch leaned against a pillar, arms folded, his bushy eyebrows drawn together. Miss Marple took a seat at the back content to watch the ripples spread. Reverend Hale clapped for attention. "We proceed as planned," he declared, though his voice wavered. "Margaret, you will take the solo until Eliza returns." A collective gasp rose. Margaret's cheeks flushed crimson, but she nodded stiffly. Timothy opened his mouth to protest, then closed it under the Reverend's glare. The rehearsal began halting, and off-key voices straining to fill the gap left by Eliza's absence. Midway through the first hymn, a sharp cry pierced the air. Mrs. Phipps burst through the side door, her apron twisted in her hands. "She's there," she gasped, pointing toward the vestry. Up in the loft, cold as ice, the group surged forward, Miss Marple rising smoothly to follow. The narrow staircase to the choir loft spiraled upward, its steps worn smooth by centuries of feet. At the top, the door stood ajar, a sliver of shadow spilling out. Reverend Hale pushed inside first and froze. Eliza lay sprawled across the wooden floor, her raven hair fanned like spilled ink. Her eyes stared sightlessly at the vaulted ceiling, a single red rose pinned to her chest. The room smelled faintly of lilies and something metallic. Margaret let out a strangled sob, while Timothy turned away, retching against the wall. Mr. Finch knelt beside the body, his thick fingers searching for a pulse that wasn't there. Miss Marple stepped closer, her gaze sweeping the scene. The loft window stood open, a chill breeze stirring the sheet music scattered across the floor. A music stand lay toppled, its metal edge gleaming. No footprints marred the dust on the sill, yet the drop to the ground below was sheer stone. The door had been locked from the inside. Mrs. Phipps had said key still in the lock on this side. How had death entered and left without a trace? Reverend Hale recovered enough to usher everyone downstairs. Constable Jenkins arrived within the hour, his notebook trembling in his hand. He sealed the loft and took statements, each choir member recounting the previous evening's rehearsal. Margaret claimed she had gone straight home to practice her part. Timothy admitted lingering to lock up, but swore the loft was empty. Mr. Finch grumbled about city folk bringing trouble, then fell silent under the constable's stare. Miss Marple lingered in the nave, her eyes on the rose. Its petals were fresh dew still clinging to the stem. Someone had placed it deliberately, a message or a signature. She recalled the flower beds behind the church, where Reverend Hale grew prize roses for the altar. One bush bore blooms exactly this shade of crimson. The gardener's shed stood unlocked. She had noticed earlier a pair of secateurs missing from the hook. As the constable departed with his notes, the choir dispersed like smoke. Margaret hurried away, clutching her handbag. Timothy vanished toward the river path. Mr. Finch remained lighting a candle at the side altar, his lips moving in silent prayer. Miss Marple watched them all, her mind turning over the locked door, the open window, the solitary rose. Death had sung its own note in the choir loft, and the melody was far from over. The village held its breath, waiting for the next verse. Chapter 3. Shadows in the Vestry. The church door thudded shut behind the last departing choir member, leaving only the echo of footsteps and the low moan of wind through the rafters. Miss Marple stood alone in the nave, her umbrella hooked over one arm, her eyes fixed on the stained glass above the altar where St. Cecilia held a silent harp. Afternoon light slanted through the coloured panes, painting the stone floor in fractured blues and golds. She moved slowly toward the vestry, the small room adjoining the chancel, where Reverend Hale kept his robes and ledgers. The door was ajar, a brass key glinting in the lock. She pushed it open with 2 fingers. Inside, the air was thick with incense and old paper. A single candle guttered on the desk, casting long shadows across shelves of hymnals and parish records. On the blotter lay a half-finished sermon, the ink still wet. Miss Marple bent closer. The handwriting was Hale's precise angular script, but the final sentence trailed off mid-word. "And let us remember that pride goeth before." She straightened and turned to the oak cabinet where the choir robes hung in neat rows. Each garment bore a name tag stitched in red thread. Eliza's was missing. A soft scrape sounded behind her. She whirled to find Timothy Grant framed in the doorway, his face pale beneath a shock of sandy hair. His choir robe hung loose on his narrow shoulders, the hem brushing muddy boots. "Miss Marple," he stammered, clutching a crumpled sheet of music. "I forgot this. It's the new arrangement for the solo." His fingers trembled as he held it out. She took the paper, noting the fresh creases and a faint smear of dirt along one edge. Timothy's eyes darted to the cabinet, then away. "I was looking for my cufflinks," he added too quickly. "They're silver with a tiny treble clef. Eliza gave them to me." Miss Marple folded the music carefully. "You were close then," she said, not a question. Timothy swallowed. "She helped me with my breathing, said I had potential." His voice cracked on the last word. He backed toward the door, nearly tripping over the prayer kneeler. "I have to go. Mum's expecting me." He fled, leaving the vestry door swinging. Miss Marple waited until his footsteps faded, then opened the cabinet fully. The robes parted like theatre curtains, revealing a narrow gap at the back. She reached in and drew out a small leather-bound book no larger than her palm. The cover was embossed with a faded gilt rose. Inside pages were filled with neat columns of dates and initials. E.T., £50, M.W., £20 T.G., £5. The last entry, dated 3 days ago, read E.T., £100 final. A bookmark, a pressed violet, marked the page. She slipped the book into her handbag and closed the cabinet. Outside, dusk gathered early under a bruised sky. Lanterns flickered to life along the lane as villagers hurried home from evening chores. Miss Marple walked the longer route past the rose garden behind the church. The beds were meticulously tended, each bush labelled in Hale's hand. The crimson variety, Eliza's rose, grew in the far corner, its blooms heavy and perfect. She knelt, examining the soil. A single footprint pressed deep into the soft earth, the tread of a man's boot size 10 perhaps. Nearby a broken stem lay discarded, its thorns glistening with sap. She wrapped it in her handkerchief and tucked it away. At the vicarage, Reverend Hale answered her knock himself, his collar askew. "Jane," he said, relief flooding his face. "Come in. The police have gone, but I can't shake the image." He led her to the study where a fire crackled low. Tea things stood untouched on a tray. "I found this in the loft," he said, producing a silver thimble, engraved with the initials M.W. Margaret's, I believe. "She must have dropped it during rehearsal." His hand shook as he set it down, and the window was open, though I distinctly remember latching it yesterday. Miss Marple accepted a cup, though she did not drink. "Tell me about the newcomer," he prompted. "Eliza arrived 6 weeks ago with a letter of introduction from the bishop's office. Said she needed solitude after a personal tragedy. Her voice," he closed his eyes, "was a gift from heaven. The choir had never sounded so fine. Yet she kept to herself. No visitors, no letters. Only that rose she wore in her hair every practice." He rose abruptly, crossing to the window. "I blame myself. If I had noticed the tensions, Margaret's resentment, Timothy's infatuation, even old Finch muttering about modern arrangements." He turned back, his face haggard. "Do you think it was one of us, Jane?" Miss Marple considered the thimble, the footprint, the little black book. "Murder," she said gently, "is rarely the work of a single moment. It grows like ivy from cracks we scarcely see." She set her cup down untouched. "May I borrow your garden shears tomorrow? I promised Mrs. Bantry a cutting for her arbour." Hale nodded distractedly. "Of course. Anything." He saw her to the door where night had fully fallen, stars hidden behind racing clouds. As she stepped onto the gravel path, a figure detached itself from the shadow of the yew tree. Margaret Wilkins, her coat buttoned to the throat, a scarf wound tight around her neck. "Miss Marple," she whispered, clutching a small parcel. "I must speak with you. Not here. At the bridge in 10 minutes. The older woman hesitated, then nodded. Margaret melted back into darkness. Miss Marple walked on, her mind cataloguing details. The missing robe, the ledger, the footprint, the thimble, the broken rose. At the stone bridge spanning the brook, she waited, lantern light from the mill glinting on the water. Margaret arrived breathless, clutching the parcel to her chest. "It's for Eliza," she said, voice trembling. "A peace offering. I was cruel yesterday. This morning I baked her favourite lemon biscuits." She undid the string, revealing a tin decorated with faded violets. Inside, the biscuits lay in perfect rows, each topped with a candied peel. Miss Marple lifted one. The scent was sharp sweet, with a darker note beneath, almond perhaps. She replaced it carefully. "When did you last see Eliza alive?" Margaret's eyes filled. "After rehearsal. She asked to borrow my thimble, said hers had rolled under the organ. I gave it to her, then left. I swear that's all." Her fingers twisted the scarf. "Someone's saying I poisoned the biscuits, but they're untouched. See?" She opened the tin wider. Miss Marple noted the faint powdering of sugar on the lid, and a single biscuit slightly askew, its candied peel missing. A sudden rustle in the hedge made them both start. Timothy emerged, his face streaked with tears. "Mrs. Wilkins," he choked, "I heard. It wasn't you." I saw. He glanced over his shoulder, then bolted toward the fields. Margaret stared after him, then at Miss Marple, her expression crumbling. "What have we done?" Miss Marple took the tin, closing the lid firmly. "Go home, Margaret. Lock your doors." She watched the woman hurry away, then turned toward her cottage, the weight of the ledger and the biscuit tin heavy in her bag. Behind her, the church loomed black against the sky, its bell tolling 9 slow strokes. Somewhere in the darkness, a killer walked free, and the ivy of murder tightened its grip. At home, she lit her lamp and spread her findings across the table. The little black book, the pressed violet, the broken rose stem, the thimble, the single biscuit with its missing peel. She opened the ledger again, studying the initials. E.T. Eliza, Thorn, M.W. Margaret Wilkins, T.G. Timothy, Grant. The amounts increased, with each entry culminating in Eliza's final £100. Blackmail or debt? She turned to the biscuit tin and carefully pried up the false bottom, a trick she had learned from a magician nephew. Beneath lay a folded sheet of onion skin paper, Eliza's handwriting flowed across it. Payment secures silence. Next installment due Christmas Eve, or the village learns everything. Miss Marple sat back, the fire settling into embers. The melody of murder had found its rhythm, and the next note would fall before dawn. Chapter 4. The midnight bell. The grandfather clock in Miss Marple's hall struck 12, its chime low and mournful. She had not slept. The ledger lay open under the lamp, its pages turned to the final entry. The biscuit tin stood beside it, the false bottom removed, the blackmail note smoothed flat. She traced the elegant loops of Eliza's script, then closed the book and rose. Her coat was already on, her walking shoes laced. She took a small torch from the drawer and slipped out into the night. The village lay hushed under a thin frost. Her breath clouded as she followed the lane past shuttered cottages to the churchyard gate. The iron latch lifted without sound. Gravel crunched softly beneath her feet as she moved between leaning headstones toward the side door of the church. It stood ajar, a deliberate wedge of darkness. She eased inside and let the door settle behind her. Moonlight filtered through the high windows, striping the nave in silver and shadow. She kept to the wall, her torch unlit. A faint glow pulsed from the chancel, the flicker of a single candle. She crept forward, each pew a silent witness. At the altar rail, Reverend Hale knelt, his head bowed. His hands clasped so tightly the knuckles gleamed white. He did not hear her approach. "Thomas," she said softly. He startled upright, his cassock rumpled, his eyes red-rimmed. "Jane, I couldn't sleep." The police telephoned. They found poison in the rosewater on the high altar. Cyanide. Enough to kill in minutes. He pressed a hand to his mouth. Someone meant it for the communion cup. Miss Marple glanced at the crystal cruet still stoppered on the linen cloth. A faint almond scent lingered. She lifted the Argento, the stopper, and tilted the vessel. A pale residue clung to the glass. Hale watched horrified. Who would desecrate the sacrament? She replaced the stopper. Someone who knew the choir drank from it after practice. Eliza always took the first sip to steady her throat. She turned to him. "Where do you keep the garden chemicals?" "In the shed behind the roses. Locked. But the key hangs on a nail inside the vestry. Anyone could have taken it." He followed her gaze to the side door. "I came to pray," he whispered. Then I heard footsteps upstairs. In the loft. They moved together up the spiral stair, the wood creaking under their combined weight. The loft door hung open, moonlight spilling across the floorboards. The chalk outline of Eliza's body remained a ghost in white. In its center lay a fresh object, a single silver cufflink shaped like a treble clef. Miss Marple knelt and picked it up. The pin was bent, the clasp broken. "Timothy," she said. Hale stared. "He was here?" "Listen." A faint scrape echoed from the organ loft below. They descended quickly, crossing the chancel to the narrow ladder that led upward. The organ bench was empty, but sheet music lay scattered as though rifled in haste. On the music rack, a new page had been pinned, the soprano solo from the Christmas piece. Every rest had been slashed through with red ink, the word liar scrawled across the staves. Miss Marple folded the page and tucked it into her pocket. She climbed down and beckoned Hale to the vestry. The garden shed key was missing from its nail. Together they stepped into the night, the frost crunching underfoot. The shed door yawned wide. Inside, shelves of seed packets and fertilizers stood undisturbed, but a corked bottle on the workbench was half empty. The label read, "Potassium cyanide for pest control." A measuring spoon lay beside it, crusted with white crystals. Hale swayed. "I used it last spring on the wasp nest. I thought it was full." Miss Marple lifted the spoon. "One dose missing." She wrapped it in her handkerchief. Footprints led from the shed across the grass toward the river path, small and neat, a woman's shoe. They followed the trail to the water where it vanished at the muddy bank. A rowboat bobbed against the reeds, its painter newly cut. Back at the church, they barred the doors and returned to the vestry. Hale sank into his chair. "The choir meets at dawn for the funeral rehearsal. What do I tell them?" "Tell them the truth," she replied. "That death has visited twice and will not stop until the song is finished." She left him there candle guttering and walked home through the frozen dark. At her gate a darker shape detached itself from the hedge. Mr. Finch stepped forward, his greatcoat buttoned to the chin, a flat cap pulled low. His breath steamed in the cold. "I saw you," he rumbled. "In the church." His eyes flicked to her bulging handbag. "Found something, have you?" Miss Marple met his gaze steadily. "A cufflink, a poison bottle, a slashed score, and a boat on the river. Care to explain, Harold?" He glanced over his shoulder, then leaned closer. "Eliza came to me 3 weeks ago. Said she had papers about my bankruptcy 20 years back. Threatened to tell the parish council unless I paid. I gave her £50 the first time, then another 20. Last week she wanted 100 or the whole village would know." His voice roughened. "I haven't got 100, and tonight I followed Timothy. He was crying, carrying something wrapped in his robe. He went to the loft, then the organ. I lost him at the river." Finch's hands clenched. "I didn't kill her, Miss Marple, but I wanted to." She studied his weathered face. "Go home, Harold. Lock your door and bring me your bank ledger in the morning." He nodded once and melted into the night. Inside her cottage, Miss Marple added the cufflink, the measuring spoon, the slashed music, and the poison bottle to her table. She opened her own small ledger and wrote, "Eliza blackmailed Margaret Thimble Biscuit's debt unknown. Eliza blackmailed Timothy Cufflink's infatuation leverage. Eliza blackmailed Finch bankruptcy, 50 plus 20 equals 70 owed 100. Poison in rosewater meant for communion cup. Boat on river escape or delivery. Slashed score warning or confession." She underlined the last line twice. At 3 o'clock the church bell tolled once, unbidden, its rope swaying in the empty tower. She looked out the window. A light moved in the belfry, slow and deliberate. Someone was climbing the spiral stair to the bell chamber. Miss Marple took her torch and a stout walking stick. She crossed the square, the frost crackling like breaking glass. The belfry door stood open. She ascended the narrow stairs, the wood groaning under her slight weight. At the top, the bell hung motionless, its great bronze mouth silent. On the floorboards lay a coil of new rope and a single red rose identical to the one on Eliza's body. A gloved hand reached from the shadows and yanked the rope. The bell swung its tongue, striking a single deep note that rolled across the sleeping village. Miss Marple raised her torch. The beam caught Margaret Wilkins, her face streaked with tears, her scarf trailing like a noose. In her other hand she clutched a small revolver. "It was supposed to be Eliza," she whispered. "The poison. I put it in the rosewater after rehearsal. But she never drank. She laughed at me, said my biscuits were childish. Then she showed me the ledger. Said tomorrow everyone would know I forged the church raffle tickets to pay her." Margaret's voice rose. "I came tonight to destroy the book, but it's gone." Miss Marple kept her voice calm. "The book is safe, Margaret. Put the gun down." Margaret shook her head. "Timothy saw me with the poison. Helltell. And Finch, he knows about the raffle. They all know now." She raised the revolver higher. The bell rope twitched. From the stairwell, Timothy appeared, his face ghost white. "Mrs. Wilkins," he pleaded, "don't. I took the ledger. I was going to burn it. To protect you." He held up the small black book, its pages fluttering. Margaret wavered. "You?" Miss Marple stepped forward. "The poison killed no one tonight, Margaret, but another death will not erase the past." She reached out slowly. "Give me the gun." For a long moment the only sound was the wind whistling through the Louvre. Then Margaret's arm dropped the revolver, clattering to the boards. Timothy rushed forward, catching her as she crumpled sobbing. Miss Marple picked up the gun and the ledger. Dawn was still hours away, but the longest night was ending. She looked down at the village roofs, silvered with frost. Somewhere below, Constable Jenkins stirred in his bed. Soon, the full choir would gather to bury their soloist, and the final verse would be sung in daylight. Chapter 5. The Funeral Rehearsal. Pale light seeped through the church windows as the first members of the choir arrived, bundled in scarves and heavy coats. The frost had hardened overnight, turning the churchyard paths into glassy ruts. Constable Jenkins stood at the main door, his helmet tucked under one arm, his notebook open to a fresh page. He greeted each arrival with the same quiet words. Mind the step and stay together inside. Reverend Hale waited in the porch, his face drawn but composed. He shook hands mechanically, murmuring thanks for coming on such a sorrowful morning. Miss Marple slipped in through the side entrance and took her usual seat near the font. From there she could watch every face as it entered. Margaret arrived first, her eyes swollen, her coat buttoned wrong. She clutched a small prayer book and kept her gaze fixed on the floor. Timothy followed minutes later, his hair uncombed, his shoes still caked with river mud. He hesitated at the threshold, then slid into the back pew opposite Miss Marple. Mr. Finch came last, his boots leaving damp prints on the flagstones. He carried a folded ledger under one arm and placed it on the pew beside him without a word. Reverend Hale raised both hands. "Let us begin with prayer." The choir rose, rustling like dry leaves. Voices joined in the familiar words, but the harmony was thin and ragged. When they reached "Deliver us from evil," Margaret faltered, her lips moving soundlessly. Timothy stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched. Finch's deep bass rumbled on alone, carrying the line to its end. Hale lowered his hands. "Today, we rehearse the service for Eliza. The police have released the loft, but the vestry remains sealed. We will use the nave. Margaret, you will sing the solo as planned." A murmur rippled through the group. Margaret lifted her head, her eyes wide. Hale continued. "It is what Eliza would have wanted. Let the music speak for her." The organist, Mrs. Larter, struck the opening chords of Pi Jesu. Margaret stepped forward, her hands trembling at her sides. Her voice started small, then grew steadier, filling the vaulted space with sweet sorrow. Halfway through the verse, a single red petal drifted from the gallery above, landing on the altar cloth. Every head turned. Another petal followed, then a slow rain of crimson. Someone gasped. Timothy bolted upright, his face drained of colour. Miss Marple rose quietly and moved to the spiral stair. The petals led upward in a deliberate trail. She climbed steadily, her hand on the rail. At the loft, the chalk outline had been smeared as though a shoe had scuffed across it. A square of paper was pinned to the music stand with a thorn. She unpinned it carefully. The same red ink slashed across the page. "The solo is cursed. Stop the song or join her." Beneath the words, a crude drawing of a noose circled the treble clef. She folded the note and descended. The choir stood frozen, Margaret mid-phrase, her mouth open. Hale stared upward, his face ashen. Miss Marple held up the paper. "Another warning. Someone does not want this music sung." Constable Jenkins pushed through the group. "Let me see that." He read the note, then scanned the faces. "Right. No one leaves until I say." He turned to Hale. "Clear the loft again, Vicar. I want every inch searched." While Jenkins and Hale climbed the stairs, the choir huddled in the nave. Margaret sank onto a pew, her prayer book falling open to a pressed violet, the same flower Miss Marple had found in the ledger. Timothy edged closer to her. "I should have burned it," he whispered. "All of it." She shook her head violently. "You tried to help. That counts for something." Finch remained apart, his ledger now open on his knee. He ran a thick finger down columns of figures, then snapped it shut. He caught Miss Marple's eye and gave a single grim nod. Jenkins returned, shaking his head. "No one up there." Petals came from a bunch stuffed behind the organ pipes. "Fresh cut this morning." He held up a plastic evidence bag containing a small pair of secateurs, the blades stained with sap. "Recognize these, Vicar?" Hale took the bag, his hands shaking. "From the garden shed. I thought them lost." The constable addressed the group. "These petals match the rose on the body. Same stem length, same thorn pattern. Someone brought a whole bouquet up there overnight." He looked at each face in turn. "Any of you visit the church after dark?" Silence. Then Finch cleared his throat. "I walked the churchyard at 11. Saw nothing." Timothy stared at his shoes. Margaret twisted her scarf until the fringe frayed. Miss Marple spoke quietly. "The petals were meant to fall during the solo. A spectacle. A threat." She turned to Margaret. "When you practiced the Pi Jesu alone, did you ever leave your music here overnight?" Margaret nodded slowly. "Always. I marked my breathing with pencil. Eliza hated that. Said it ruined the page. Jenkins made a note, so the killer knew exactly where to find the score. He looked up. Right. Practice is over. Go home. Stay there until I come round for statements. He dismissed them with a wave. As the group filed out, Miss Marple lingered by the font. Hale approached, wiping his brow. Jane, what does it mean? First poison. Then warnings, now this theatrical nonsense. It means the killer is still singing, she replied. And the audience is the entire village. Outside, the sun had risen fully, but the air remained sharp. Villagers gathered in knots along the lane, whispering behind gloved hands. A boy on a bicycle skidded to a halt, staring at the church door, where a single red petal clung to the iron hinge. Miss Marple watched Margaret hurry toward the bridge, her coat flapping like a broken wing. Timothy lingered at the lich gate, lighting a cigarette with shaking fingers. Finch strode off toward the vicarage, his ledger once more under his arm. At her cottage, Miss Marple laid the new note beside the others. The handwriting matched the slash score, the same angry slant, the same pressure on the downstroke. She opened Finch's ledger. The entries were meticulous, every withdrawal recorded. On the page, dated 3 weeks earlier, a line read, Cash to E.T., £50, roses. Another a week later, Cash to E.T., £20, silence. The final entry yesterday, cash withdrawn, £100, Christmas fund. The sum was crossed out and beneath it in fresh ink, returned unspent. She closed the book and looked out the window. Across the square, Constable Jenkins emerged from the police station carrying a cardboard box. He loaded it into his car and drove toward the river road. Miss Marple took her coat and followed at a distance. The river ran slow and slate-grey under the willows. Jenkins parked at the boatyard and spoke to the keeper, an old man with a pipe clenched in his teeth. Miss Marple stayed behind a hedge. The keeper pointed downstream, then handed over a key. Jenkins unlocked the gate to the mooring and boarded the same rowboat seen the night before. He lifted something from the floorboards, a sodden bundle wrapped in a choir robe. He laid it in the box with care. Miss Marple stepped forward. Morning, Constable. Found what you were looking for? He straightened, startled. Miss Marple shouldn't be here. He hesitated, then opened the bundle. Inside lay Eliza's missing robe, soaked through and heavy with river water. A deep tear ran from collar to hem, the edges dark with dried blood. Weighted with the hymnals, he said quietly. Kept it from floating. Planned to retrieve it later, I reckon. She examined the tear. Not made by a blade. The threads are pulled as though caught on something sharp. A nail, perhaps, or a thorn. Jenkins nodded. Matches the secateurs. He looked at her squarely. Margaret Wilkins bought rat poison from the hardware last month. Same compound as the cyanide, and her footprints were by the shed. Miss Marple folded her arms. Margaret intended to poison Eliza, yes. But the rose on the body, the petals in the loft, those are signatures. Margaret would not sign her work. She wants the music to continue. Someone else wants it silenced forever. Jenkins rubbed his chin. Then who? She gazed downstream where the river bent toward the old mill. Someone who can climb to the gallery unseen. Someone who knows every crevice of this church. Someone the choir trusts enough to let close. A shout from the boatyard turned their heads. The keeper waved frantically. Jenkins locked the gate and they ran. At the water's edge, a body floated face down, caught in the reeds. Dark hair fanned out like ink. For a heartbeat, Miss Marple thought it was Eliza again. Then the keeper hooked the collar with a pole and turned the face toward them. Timothy Grant stared up at the sky, his eyes filmed with death. A red rose was pinned to his sodden shirt. The stem thrust through the fabric into his chest. In his rigid hand, he clutched a single sheet of music, the Pai Jesu solo, every note scratched out in red. Jenkins swore under his breath. Miss Marple knelt at the bank, her fingers brushing the boy's cold cheek. The final verse had been sung after all, and the choir was one voice fewer. Chapter 6. The river's confession, Constable Jenkins hauled the body onto the bank with the keeper's help. Water streamed from Timothy's clothes, pooling dark around the reeds. The red rose clung stubbornly to his chest. its petals waterlogged but intact. Miss Marple crouched beside the boy, her knees protesting on the cold earth. She lifted his free hand. The fingers were curled as though clutching something invisible. A faint bruise ringed his wrist the shape of a thumbprint. She turned the handpalm up. Under the nails lay flecks of crimson petal and something finer, pale green fibers. Jenkins barked orders into his radio. Ambulance, scene team, now. He knelt opposite her. Same rose, same pin. Killer's getting bold. Miss Marple traced the bruise. He was held from behind. Struggle was brief. She opened the sodden music sheet. The red scratches formed no words this time, only violent crosses obliterating the melody. At the bottom corner, a single word remained uncancelled. Traitor. The keeper spat into the river. Found him at first light. Thought it was a sack of rubbish till the hand floated up. He pointed downstream. Current brought him from the mill bend. That's half a mile. Miss Marple stood. The mill. Abandoned since the flood of '53. Roof half gone, but the wheel still turns when the water rises. She scanned the bank. Mud sucked at her shoes. Footprints here, shallow heel marks leading away toward the trees. Small again. A woman's or a slight man's? Jenkins followed her gaze. Same as the shed. He bagged the music sheet and the rose. "I'll get casts. You shouldn't be here, Miss Marple." She was already moving along the path, the footprints weaving between alders. 20 yards on the trail split. One set continued into the woods. The other turned sharp toward the mill. She chose the mill. The building loomed ahead. Its stone walls black with damp, the great wheel creaking in the current. The lower door hung off one hinge. Inside, the air smelled of rot and wet grain. Sunlight slanted through broken slates, striping the floor in dusty bars. A circle of hymnals lay in the center, arranged like a crude altar. Each book was open to the same page, the Pi Jesu. Red ink bled across every line. In the middle stood a glass jam jar filled with river water. Floating on the surface, a single red petal spun slowly. Miss Marple lifted the jar. Beneath the petal lay a silver thimble. Margaret's thimble, the initials M.W. clearly visible. She set the jar down, exactly as found. Footprints crossed the dusty floor toward the wheel housing. She followed. The mechanism groaned behind a lattice of rotten boards. A narrow ladder led upward to the loft where grain once poured into sacks. She climbed carefully, testing each rung. At the top, a makeshift camp bedding roll, tin mug, half-eaten biscuit. A choir robe hung on a nail, Eliza's robe, the tear now roughly stitched with black thread. Beside it, a small leather case. She opened it. Inside lay a syringe, 2 empty ampules labeled potassium cyanide, and a folded letter. The letter was addressed to Timothy, in Eliza's hand. "My dear boy, the money was never enough. Your silence is worth more. Meet me at the mill midnight, or the ledger goes to the police. Bring the 100 Finch O's. We will leave together." The signature flourished beneath, like a mocking soprano trill. Miss Marple folded the letter and slipped it into her pocket. She descended and returned to the jar. The thimble caught the light. Margaret had been here or been brought here. She examined the hymnals. One book was newer, the others worn. She opened it. Inside the cover, a dedication. "To Timothy with love from E.T. Christmas 1948. The date was last year. She closed the book. The boy had kept it all this time. Outside, sirens approached. She stepped into the daylight as the ambulance pulled up. Jenkins waved her over. "Mill's been used," he reported. "Sleeping bag food wrappers. Someone's been living rough." He held up a plastic bag. "Found this in the reeds. A woman's scarf, violet silk. Smells of lavender." Miss Marple recognized it. Margaret's scarf, the one she wore at the bridge. She took the bag. Threads matched the green fibers under Timothy's nails. She was here. Struggled. Jenkins' face hardened. "Margaret Wilkins. Poison footprints scarf. It's adding up." Miss Marple shook her head. "Margaret baked biscuits and forged raffle tickets. She did not drag a grown boy half a mile through mud and drown him. Look at the bruise on his wrist. The hand that held him was stronger." They returned to the body. The ambulance men lifted Timothy onto a stretcher. As they did, a small object fell from his pocket and clinked onto the path. Jenkins picked it up. A brass key, old and heavy. "Church key," he said. Fits the belfry door. Miss Marple turned the key in her fingers. Timothy took the ledger to protect Margaret. Eliza lured him here with a promise of escape. Someone else followed. Jenkins sealed the key in another bag. Right. I'm bringing Margaret in. And Finch. And the vicar. Whole lot of them. Miss Marple watched the stretcher loaded. The river keeps its own counsel, she murmured, but it gives up its dead. Back in the village, the church bell tolled 11 slow strokes, though no hand pulled the rope. Villagers gathered in the square, faces pale. Reverend Hale emerged from the vicarage, his cassock unbuttoned. He raised both hands. The funeral is postponed. Police orders, go home. Pray for the boy. Margaret stood at the edge of the crowd, her scarf missing, her coat unbuttoned despite the cold. She stared at the church door, where another red petal had appeared, nailed to the wood with a thorn. Her knees buckled. Finch caught her elbow, steering her away. Timothy, she whispered. Not Timothy, Miss Marple approached. Margaret, the mill. You were there. Margaret's eyes filled. She took me, said she would clear my name if I brought the raffle money. I went at dusk. Timothy was already there, tied to the wheel. Eliza laughed, said he was the bait. Then someone hit me. When I woke, the jar was there, the thimble inside. I ran. Who hit you? I didn't see. A shadow. Tall. Strong. Finch released her arm. I followed them, he growled. Saw the light in the mill. Got there too late. Timothy was in the water. Eliza was gone. I cut the boy loose, but the current took him. Jenkins arrived, sirens silent now. Margaret Wilkins, Harold Finch, you're both coming with me. He gestured to the car. Miss Marple stepped forward. Constable. The key in Timothy's pocket opens the belfry. Someone locked the door after the midnight bell. Check the rope for fibres. Jenkins nodded to his sergeant. Do it. As Margaret and Finch were led away, Miss Marple walked to the church. The petal on the door fluttered in the breeze. She unpinned it. The thorn was long and sharp, stained dark at the tip. Blood. Not Timothy's. She wrapped it carefully. Inside the church was empty, the nave dim. She climbed to the belfry. The rope hung still, dust motes dancing in the shaft of light. She examined the fibres caught in the rough hemp-green silk violet threads. Margaret's scarf. But higher up the rope was clean. Someone had climbed above the fray. She descended and entered the vestry. The cabinet stood open. Eliza's robe was gone from its hook. She opened the parish register. The page for baptisms was torn out. On the desk, a fresh sheet of music lay waiting the Pi Jesu once more. This time, every note was intact, but beneath the title, a new line in red. The choir sings at dusk. All must attend, or the next voice falls silent. Miss Marple folded the music. The killer conducted from the shadows, and the final performance loomed. She looked out the window. Across the square, Jenkins' car pulled away. The church bell remained silent, but the village held its breath. Dusk was only hours away, and the river had more to confess. Chapter 7. The Choir. That sang at dusk, the sky over St. Mary Mead turned the colour of dried blood as the sun sank behind the church tower. Villagers moved like shadows along the lanes, their faces pinched with cold and dread. Every window was shuttered, every door bolted, yet no one stayed indoors. They drifted toward the church, drawn by the note pinned to the vestry door. The choir sings at dusk. All must attend, or the next voice falls silent. The words were written in the same slashing red ink that had ruined the music sheets. Constable Jenkins had stationed 2 officers at the lich gate and 1 at each side door. He himself stood in the porch, his whistle ready. No one enters alone, he told Miss Marple when she arrived, and no one leaves until I say. She nodded and slipped past him into the nave. Candles guttered in iron sconces, throwing pools of gold onto the stone. The pews were already half full. Mrs. Larter sat rigid at the organ, her fingers resting on the keys as though afraid to play. Reverend Hale stood before the altar, his surplice crisp, but his eyes hollow. Margaret Wilkins sat in the front row, flanked by Finch on one side and an empty space on the other. Her wrists bore faint red marks from the handcuffs removed only an hour earlier. Finch's greatcoat was unbuttoned, revealing the same muddy boots he had worn at the river. Timothy's place in the tenor section remained vacant, a single red rose laid across the hymn book. Miss Marple took her seat near the font. From here she could see every face, every twitch of fear or guilt. The clock above the west door struck 6. The last villager hurried in. Jenkins closed the main door and dropped the bar. The side doors followed with heavy thuds. The church was sealed. Hale raised trembling hands. "Let us pray." The words came out flat. Heads bowed, but eyes stayed open, darting toward the gallery, the loft, the shadows beneath the pulpit. Mrs. Larter lifted her hands, and the organ breathed a low, ominous chord. The choir rose as one. Margaret's voice led the Pi Jesu clear and steady, now threaded with desperation. The harmony followed, halting at first, then stronger, as though the music itself refused to die. Halfway through the first verse, the candles along the south wall flickered and died. A draught swept the nave cold as a grave. Gasps rose. Jenkins swung his torch beam upward. The gallery was empty. Another gust, and the north candles guttered out. Darkness crept forward pew by pew. Mrs. Larter's hands faltered on the keys. Margaret sang on alone, her voice soaring into the sudden gloom. A single spotlight snapped on from the organ loft, bathing the altar in harsh white. In its circle stood a figure robed in black, the hood drawn low. One gloved hand held a silver baton, the other a crimson rose. The choir froze. Hale stepped forward. "Who are you? Show yourself." The figure raised the baton. The organ crashed into the opening bars of the Dies Irae. Against every instinct, the choir began to sing the words of wrath and judgment. Margaret's eyes never left the hooded shape. Finch's bass rumbled like distant thunder. The spotlight widened, revealing the chalk outline in the loft above, now freshly drawn in red. Miss Marple rose silently and moved along the side aisle. She reached the vestry door and turned the handle. Locked. She drew a hairpin from her bun and worked the mechanism. The lock clicked. She slipped inside. The vestry was dark, but a thin line of light showed beneath the garden door. She crossed the room and eased it open. The rose garden lay still under frost, the crimson blooms black in the twilight. A narrow footprint led from the door to the shed and back. She followed. The shed door stood open. Inside, the cyanide bottle was gone. In its place, a single playing card, the Queen of Hearts, her face scratched out in red. She returned to the vestry and closed the door softly. From her handbag, she took the brass belfry key and fitted it into the lock of the small cupboard above the safe. Inside lay a reel of fishing line, thin and strong. She pocketed it and stepped back into the nave. The choir had reached the final verse. The hooded figure lowered the baton. Silence fell absolute. Then a voice. Not Margaret's, not any voice they knew, spoke from the gallery, smooth and chilling. "The solo is mine now. The curse is lifted. But one debt remains unpaid." Jenkins shouted up there. His officers pounded up the spiral stair. Boots thundered overhead. The spotlight swiveled, catching only dust and empty air. The black robe lay discarded across the rail, the rose pinned to its hem. Margaret swayed. Finch caught her. Hale stared at the robe, his mouth working soundlessly. Miss Marple moved to the altar and lifted the rose. The stem was wrapped in violet silk threads torn from a scarf. She turned to the choir. "The performance is over, but the conductor has left us a finale." Jenkins descended red-faced. Gone. Vanished. "There's a rope from the gallery window to the yew tree. Cut and dropped." He held up a length of fishing line glinting in the torchlight. "Same as the belfry. Same as the mill wheel." Miss Marple addressed the silent assembly. "The killer needed every voice here tonight. Needed us to see the robe, the rose, the spotlight. A magician's misdirection. While we watched the stage, the real act happened elsewhere." She led Jenkins and Hale to the vestry garden door. The footprint in the frost had been joined by another larger, heavier. They followed the new trail across the churchyard to the river path. There in the mud beside the boathouse lay the cyanide bottle, corked and full. Beside it, a woman's shoe, small and neat, the heel snapped clean. Jenkins lifted the shoe. "Margaret's no," said Miss Marple. "Look at the wear on the sole. Left foot heavier. Margaret favors her right. This belongs to someone who limps slightly. Someone who stood for hours in the organ loft. Mrs. Larter. They ran back to the church. The organ bench was empty. Sheet music lay scattered. On the music rack, a final note in red ink. The Queen is dead. Long live the choir. Jenkins radioed for cars. Hale sank onto the bench, his head in his hands. She was here all along. Every rehearsal, every funeral. Her hands on the keys. Miss Marple picked up a fallen page. The Pai Jesu again. But this time the margin held tiny handwriting. E.T. stole my solo in 1948. She stole my life. Tonight I took it back. The church door burst open. A young constable, breathless. Sir, the old mill. Fire. Whole place going up. They spilled into the night. Across the fields, flames licked the sky, the mill wheel glowing red. Sirens wailed from the main road. Miss Marple watched the fire climb. Mrs. Larter had chosen her final stage, and the river would keep her secret no longer. But one question remained. The spotlight, the robe, the voice from the gallery. Mrs. Larter had played the organ. Who had conducted the choir in her place? Miss Marple turned back to the church. In the porch beneath the single bulb stood Reverend Hale, his face streaked with tears. In his hand he held the black robe, the hood now pushed back. His eyes met hers, steady and terrible. The choir was never the target, Jane. It was the mirror. Every note, every face reflected what I lost. Eliza took my daughter's place in the choir 20 years ago. Took her voice, her future. I waited, I watched. Tonight the mirror broke. He dropped the robe and raised both hands' palms open. The fishing line was still wrapped around his wrists, thin and glittering like a garrote. Arrest me, constable. The song is finished. Jenkins stepped forward, cuffs ready. Hale did not resist. Margaret wept silently in the doorway. Finch stood beside her, his great hand on her shoulder. The fire roared across the fields, painting the church windows blood red. Miss Marple watched the constable lead Hale away. The village would wake to a new morning silent at last. The choir would never sing again. Chapter 8. The ashes of the mill flames crowned the old mill by the time the fire engines screamed into the lane. Water hissed against burning timber, sending up clouds of steam that glowed orange in the dark. Villagers lined the riverbank, wrapped in blankets, their faces lit like masks in a lantern parade. Constable Jenkins kept them back with outstretched arms while his men uncoiled hoses. Miss Marple stood apart near the boathouse, the heat reaching her cheeks even at this distance. The wheel turned once more in the updraft, then collapsed in a shower of sparks. Jenkins approached, wiping soot from his brow. Body inside, he said, voice rough. Charred beyond recognition, but small-frame female. Mrs. Larter, without doubt. He held up a twisted metal object. Organist's badge from the County Festival 1952. Still pinned to what's left of the coat, Miss Marple took the badge. The enamel was blistered, but the tiny treble clef remained clear. She was the Queen of Hearts after all. Scratched her own face from the card. Jenkins nodded toward the church. Hale's in the cells. Confessed everything. Said he planned it from the night Eliza arrived. Recognized her as the girl who pushed his daughter out of the choir decades ago. Daughter never sang again. Took her own life at 19. Hale kept the pain quiet, tended it like his roses. When Eliza came back with her city voice and her blackmail, he saw his chance. Miss Marple watched the fire die to embers. And Mrs. Larter? Partner in silence. She hated Eliza for the same reason. Lost the solo in 48, lost the scholarship, lost everything. They fed each other's grief. Hale supplied the poison, the ropes, the keys. Larter staged the warnings, the petals, the spotlight. Together they wrote the score. A fireman emerged from the ruins carrying a metal box, scorched but intact. He handed it to Jenkins. Found this under the wheel housing. Locked. Jenkins forced the lid. Inside lay a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. On top a photograph yellowed with age. 2 young women in choir robes, arms around each other. One was unmistakably Eliza Thorne, 20 years younger. The other Mrs. Larter, her face alight with triumph. On the back in pencil, Regional Finals 1948. We were queens. Beneath the photo, The letters. Dozens of them. Eliza to Larta over the years. First congratulatory, then pleading, then threatening. The final one dated last month. Come to St. Mary Mead. Bring the past, or I bring it for you. Miss Marple closed the box. The past arrived gift-wrapped in a soprano voice. Dawn crept pale across the fields as the fire cooled to smoking rubble. The river ran black with ash. Jenkins loaded the box into his car. Margaret and Finch waited by the police van statement signed eyes hollow. Margaret spoke first, her voice a thread. Timothy tried to save me. He didn't know the mill was the trap. I should have told him everything. Finch patted her shoulder awkwardly. Boy thought he was in love. Love makes fools of us all. Miss Marple walked the river path alone. At the bend where Timothy's body had lodged, she stopped. The reeds were trampled flat. Someone had stood here long after the police left. She knelt. In the mud a single red petal lay half submerged, its edges curling. Beside it a fresh footprint deeper than the others. A man's boot size 10. Hale's garden clogs. She straightened. The Reverend had returned one last time to watch his creation burn. Back in the village, the church stood open, its doors flung wide as though to air a sickness. Inside, the nave was stripped of roses petals, hymnals. Only the chalk outline remained, a pale scar on the loft floor. Mrs. Bantry met her at the font, arms full of lilies. For the altar, she said briskly. Life goes on, Jane, even here. Miss Marple took a lily and laid it across the outline. The flower's scent rose clean and sharp. Yes, she said, but memory lingers in the stones. That afternoon, the inquest opened in the village hall. Hale sat between two officers, his wrists cuffed, his head high. He spoke without prompt, voice calm. I killed Eliza with the rose stem through the heart, quick and silent. Timothy I held under until the struggling stopped. Mrs. Larta lit the mill herself, walked into the flames singing the Pi Jesu. She wanted her solo back even in death. The coroner asked no questions. The verdict came swift. Murder willful and premeditated. The village exhaled. Evening found Miss Marple in her cottage, the fire low, the curtains drawn. On the table lay every piece of the puzzle arranged like a hand of patience. The ledger, the thimble, the cufflink, the fishing line, the Queen of Hearts, the burned badge, the photograph, the letters. She added the final card, the red petal from the riverbank pressed flat between glass. A knock sounded. Constable Jenkins entered, hat in hand. Thought you'd want to know. Hale asked for you. One last thing. She followed him to the station. The cell was small and clean. Hale rose as she entered his prison palace, stark against the black cassock he still wore. Jane, he said softly, the roses, will you see they're pruned before winter? Crimson ones especially. They were always her favourite. Miss Marple studied his face. Your daughters, he nodded. Eliza took more than a solo. She took a future. I gave her mine in return. She left without another word. Outside, the first snow began to fall soft and deliberate, covering the churchyard, the river, the ashes of the mill. By morning, St. Mary Mead would wake white and silent, the choir loft, empty, the organ cold. Miss Marple walked home past cottages where lights burned late. In the square, the war memorial gleamed under fresh powder. She paused and laid the pressed petal at its base. The wind lifted it gently and carried it toward the church, where it settled on the doorstep like a final note. The truth was hidden no longer. The parish choir had sung its last. Chapter 9. The silent spring snow blanketed St. Mary Mead for 3 weeks straight, muffling every footstep and every whisper. The church doors stayed locked, the key surrendered to the diocese. Yellow police tape fluttered from the loft window until the wind tore it away. Children built snowmen in the square, but none dared skate on the frozen river where Timothy had floated. The mill ruins stood black against white fields, a jagged scar no one approached. Miss Marple kept to her cottage, the fire banked high, her knitting needles clicking through scarves for the parish orphans. Letters arrived daily from her nephew Raymond, now promoted to superintendent. Case closed. Hale sentenced to hang. Larta's remains released to a sister in Devon. She read them once, then fed them to the flames. Some stories needed no epilogue. On the first day of thaw, the snow turned to slush and the river ran brown. Villagers emerged, blinking into weak sunlight. Mrs. Bantry organised a spring clean of the churchyard rakes and clippers clanging against headstones. Miss Marple joined them, her secateurs sharp. The crimson rose bushes had survived the frost, their buds tight and dark. She pruned with care, each cut deliberate. Sap bled red on her gloves. Margaret Wilkins appeared at the gate, a basket over her arm. "Lemon biscuits," she said, offering them shyly. No poison this time. She had taken a post at the village school teaching music to the little ones. Her voice when she sang the children to sleep was soft but sure. Finch lumbered behind her, carrying sacks of bulbs. Retired from banking, he now tended the memorial garden, his great hands gentle with the earth. Reverend Hale's replacement arrived in March, a young man named Mr. Clement, fresh from seminary. He unlocked the church with trembling fingers and found the nave swept clean. The organ dusted, the loft floor scrubbed bare. On the altar lay a single red rose wrapped in violet silk. No note. He placed it in water and said nothing. The choir never reformed. Mrs. Larter's organ gathered dust until a travelling player bought it for a song. The hymnals were boxed and stored in the vestry. Margaret kept one, the newest, with Timothy's dedication inside. She read it sometimes by lamplight, then closed the cover gently. Spring advanced. Daffodils pushed through the graves. The river ran clear again, carrying petals downstream. Miss Marple walked its banks daily, her stick tapping the path. One morning, she found a small bundle wedged in the reeds, a child's shoe filled with violets. She left it where it lay. In April, the diocese sent word. The church would reopen Easter Sunday. Mr. Clement practiced his sermon voice echoing in the empty nave. Villagers filed in hesitantly, taking seats far from the loft. Margaret sang the first hymn alone, her voice ringing true. No petals fell, no shadows moved. When the final amen sounded, the congregation lingered, unwilling to break the spell. Afterward in the churchyard, Miss Marple watched the young vicar lock the door. He turned the key twice, then handed it to her. "For safekeeping," he said. "Until the village is ready." She slipped the key into her pocket. "Some doors," she murmured, "are best left closed a while." Summer came warm and slow. The crimson roses bloomed fuller than ever, their scent drifting across the square. Children played beneath them, unafraid. Margaret married Finch in a quiet ceremony, the schoolroom decorated with paper chains. Miss Marple gave them a teapot and a warning. "Sing when you must, but listen always to the silence between notes." Years passed. The mill was cleared, the stones carted away. Wildflowers grew where the wheel once turned. The church bell rang again, for weddings and christenings, never for funerals. The loft became a storeroom for folding chairs and Christmas crib figures. One autumn evening, Miss Marple sat on her bench by the war memorial, knitting a tiny crimson scarf. A small girl approached, violet ribbons in her hair. "Miss," she asked, "will you teach me to sing like the lady in the picture?" Miss Marple looked up. In the child's hand was a faded photograph, two young women in choir robes, arms around each other. She took it gently. That lady, she said, had a voice like sunlight on water. But she learned too late that some songs are better left unsung. The girl tilted her head. "Will you teach me anyway?" Miss Marple smiled and began to hum a simple lullaby. The notes rose soft and clear, carried on the evening air toward the church, where the roses still bloomed and the river still ran, and the truth hidden in the parish choir slept at last beneath the quiet earth. Chapter 10. The Last Rose Miss. Marple closed her cottage door on a golden September morning, the air sweet with the last of the roses. She carried a small wicker basket lined with tissue paper and walked the familiar path to the churchyard. The gate creaked open on new hinges, the wood still pale. Inside, the graves lay neat and tended, the crimson rose bushes pruned to perfect domes. She knelt by the newest stone, a modest slab engraved, "Eliza Thorne, 1915-1955, beloved voice." No other words. No one had claimed the body. She opened the basket and drew out a single red bloom, its stem wrapped in violet silk. She laid it on the grave, then straightened the card beside it. Handwritten in her own neat script. The song ends where it began. Footsteps crunched behind her. Margaret now, Mrs. Finch, approached, her arm linked through her husband's. The years had softened her plumpness into gentle curves, her hair touched with silver. Finch carried a bunch of Michaelmas daisies, his great hands dwarfing the delicate stems. They placed the flowers beside the rose. "You kept the secret all this time," Margaret said quietly. Miss Marple turned the key in her fingers, the church key Mr. Clement had never reclaimed. Some truths are heavier than others. They belong to the earth, not the air. Finch cleared his throat. Hale wrote from prison. "Before he died, asked us to tell you the full score." Miss Marple nodded. She had known it was coming. The hangman's rope had been stayed by a heart attack in the night. Hale's last letter lay sealed in her drawer. She had waited for this moment to open it with the only two who needed to hear. They sat on the bench beneath the yew tree. Margaret unfolded a sheet of prison notepaper, the ink faded but steady. "My dear friends, I write with a clear conscience, though a heavy heart. The village believes Mrs. Larter and I acted alone. That is the story the police took and the jury accepted. But the choir had 3 voices, not 2. Eliza Thorne was never the innocent newcomer. In 1948, she arrived in St. Mary Mead as a girl of 17, already carrying scars. She seduced the choirmaster, Mr. Evelyn Grant Timothy's grandfather, with promises of London stages. When he chose his wife instead, Eliza vanished, taking with her the scholarship money and the dreams of 2 girls, my daughter and Agnes Larter. Years later, she returned as the polished soprano to finish what she started. The ledger was real, every debt recorded, but the blackmail began with me. She knew my daughter's suicide note by heart, quoted it in the vestry until I paid. Agnes overheard. Her own grief reignited. We planned together, at first poison in the rose water, a quiet end. But Timothy complicated everything. The boy inherited his grandfather's guilt and his grandmother's voice. Eliza lured him with lessons, with cufflinks, with the promise of escape. He stole the ledger to protect Margaret, whose raffle forgery Eliza had witnessed. When Timothy confronted Eliza at the mill, she laughed, told him the full history of his family's shame. He struck her with the music stand in rage. The blow killed her instantly. Agnes and I found them minutes later, Timothy weeping over the body. We made a pact, staged the locked room, pin, the rose weight, the robe in the river. Agnes added the petals, the warnings to keep the village looking at the choir, not the boy. I took the blame for the second murder because Timothy was already dead, by then drowned in panic, not malice. Agnes lit the mill to erase the evidence and herself. The third voice was Timothy's all along. The truth, hidden in the parish choir, was a grandson's accidental hand, not a reverend's deliberate one. Forgive me for the silence. Some songs must end in minor keys. Thomas Hale. Margaret folded the letter, her hands trembling. "Timothy," she whispered. All this time, Finch stared at the grave. The boy never told a soul. Carried it to the river. Miss Marple placed the church key on the bench between them. The ledger burned with the mill. The letters too. Only this remains. She opened her basket again and drew out the small black book, its cover scorched but intact. The final page held a new entry in Timothy's boyish scrawl. "I killed her. Forgive me. T.G." She closed the book. "The diocese will reopen the church next spring. Mr. Clement plans a children's choir. No solos, no crimson roses. Just simple hymns and young voices." Margaret took the key. "We'll plant violets instead," she said. "Along the riverbank." For Timothy, Finch lifted the basket. And for Eliza. She was a villain, but she was 17 once. They stood together as the sun climbed higher, gilding the headstones. Somewhere in the distance, a blackbird sang 3 clear notes. Miss Marple listened, then turned toward home. Behind her, the gate closed softly, the key turning in the lock for the last time. The truth was fully sung at last. The parish choir rested in peace beneath a blanket of violets and the river, carried the final note gently to the sea. If you enjoyed this tale of secrets and songs, like and subscribe. Your support means a lot to us. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and which village mystery you'd solve next.